So let's move to Comus, Masque, which I probably put these out of order. We should have looked at L'Allegro and Il Penseroso before this. No matter. Because there's a similarity in subject matter there. In some ways it uses the idea of the active life and the contemplative life. I'll say more about that when we do look at L'Allegro and Il Penseroso. Comus here is a villain. The poem is written in the form of, well, it's a play. This is a play meant to be performed in the form of a masque, which is a courtly form of poetry, as I believe it says here in the, do I have this? Do I even have it in here? No, I don't. What page is this on? Comus. It's Paradise Lost. If anyone's got it, please shout it out. I beg your pardon?
The Masque?
Yes. 124. Thank you, 124. But the occasion is a marriage and a celebration of the Earl of Bridgewater's election as the President of Wales. So this was presented at Ludlow Castle, and his children were actors in the play. He had 3 children, a girl and 2 boys. And there was music played. It was played by Henry Laws, who was the music tutor to the Lord Bridgewater's family, and he also composed music to it. So this music we do not have, but it accompanied the play itself. So you can imagine a play that's set to music. Well, we would call it a musical these days, right? But here the players will not sing; they will speak, but the music will accompany their performance throughout. So that's interesting. And masques have combined songs and dances and characters, realistic and also fantastic. So the sort of characters like sprites and nymphs and so forth, those will also be included in masques. And Comus was a popular name of a play in this day. And this is written in 1945. So it's right on the cusp of Milton announcing himself as an important writer. Because remember, I said that his poems, the first collection of his poems was published in 1945. So he now had a publication out of poems, including the Nativity Ode. That was the first of the poems that were included in that collection. But then this was performed. As it began with the Nativity Ode, and it concluded with Lycidas. We'll look at Lycidas in a few classes' time, and the Latin poems in between. But in the middle of the volume was this one, a masque. And it's very odd in a sense, but it is also a central event in his poetic career. This particular poem, which is a dramatic presentation, because it finishes a period of poetry. As I say, I'm taking them as somewhat out of order, but it finishes a period of his poetry which is mythological. It's got all sorts of characters with deep interest in music. As I say, he was taught music. His father was a musician. He had a great appreciation. He himself could play the organ. Vast appreciation of music, and music is a strong theme in his poetry to this point. More mythological, more musical. And this is probably the climax of that entire period. And it walks a very dark line, or a very thin line, between the dark woods that are associated with paganism and the brightness of political life and civic life. And he's about to, as I said, when we talked about his biography, he's going to move on to having a public life when he ends up being the Secretary of Foreign Tongues for Cromwell's government. And then he later on writes his great public poems, the great epics, Paradise Lost and Paradise Regained, and also his tragedy, Samson Agonistes. Question?
Yeah, sorry, when was this collection published?
Collection 1645, I believe. And this was contained in it, and it was performed at that time. So it's just, and it's right in the middle. Now, what's interesting is that the theater of the 1630s, so this is a little historical background, the theater of the 1630s is dominated by women. And this is rather interesting because he is writing in the genre in which this happens, and yet, like we see with all of his poetry, he's giving his own take on this genre that he sees around here. He doesn't remove the woman from the center of the poem. But in general, the genre of Masque has vaguely Catholic associations. And associated with Charles I's wife, Henrietta Maria. And there's a religious background to the poem here. And Milton is writing against that background in some ways. Because Henrietta Maria is Catholic. And there's a sense in the Masque as a genre of emphasizing the role of the aristocracy and the importance of the king, the monarch, in setting everything to order. And so the Masque borrowed from pastoral drama and comedy and romance, and it was very rare where historically where women performed in theatrical performances. So in Shakespeare, women do not play the parts. They're all male actors, even playing the female parts, right? Because it was regarded as, the theater was regarded as a scandalous place. It was ill-befitting women to be even associated with it. So they shouldn't be acting in it, and also they shouldn't even be around it. Well, who was around the theaters? It was largely prostitutes. So prostitutes would come in to the theaters, and the patrons who were watching the performance then had the little after performance entertainment of the prostitutes and so forth. So they were associated, they had ill associations. Many Puritans wanted the theaters to be shut down altogether. But those were the associations of theater. They were entirely negative from a religious point of view. That changed when Henrietta and Maria and her attendants acted in a play. And remember, this is the king's wife. She acts in a play called Artémis, which is a French pastoral. And the queen and her ladies acted in another play called The Shepherd's Paradise. So they're breaking the associations with that, but to some degree, they're not helping the case of true religion against the corruption that is associated with the theater, because all they're saying is, yes, well, women can also be involved in the theater, yes, but it has entirely negative associations to be associated with it. Women don't want to be associated with this. So you could say that Milton, as a Puritan, might want to avoid casting women in the role, but he does not do that. He allows the daughter of his patron here to act in the play. Because as I say, the Puritans were extremely critical of the fact that the queen herself, of all the ladies in the land, that the queen herself played a role in a theatrical performance. And it had there was social commentary going on simply by stepping on the stage and doing that. But Milton does something rather different with this. He writes his poem not for the queen or for the court, but rather for the people in general. And rather than presenting the aristocrat as the centerpiece, he presents a certain feminine ideal there. And rather than a female figure associated with corruption and decadence, which is what Henrietta Maria was doing by performing in a mask, he presented a representative representing female chastity and virtue. And so the central figure here in this play is a woman of extraordinary virtue who resists the temptation of Comus and all of the threats to her. So she is the hero of the play, not because of her position, but rather because of her character. So I think this is quite extraordinary because he is elevating the role of women and the understanding of women's roles and connecting it and saying, I'm not going to throw women out of the performance altogether. I'm going to say that women are able to resist the temptations of the devil as well. Now, this is interesting because if you read certain accounts of Paradise Lost, one of the criticisms that's come from feminist scholars is that Adam is the hero and Eve is the dumb bimbo who falls to temptation, etc. So they present Milton as a sort of misogynist. That's the standard view, at least among some feminist scholars. But this play would seem to suggest he has a better view of women than that being portrayed. Because here the woman is a hero. And she stands on the basis of her virtue. She has no help. She stands the temptations of the devil, unlike Eve, but also unlike Adam in Paradise Lost. So it's a female hero, and I think that's very interesting. Very, very interesting. But Milton takes the negative associations of putting a woman in theater. He doesn't agree with the Puritans in saying the women should have no role in it. He says that it should be a woman of virtue that we're going to look at on stage. Now, in other words, I would argue that Milton is in a sense a feminist by the modern understanding of that. He sees the full, not only the full humanity, but the entire virtue of a woman standing as an image bearer of Christ when she's clothed in Christ's righteousness. That's what he sees. It's paradise regained in female guise. I just think it's interesting. I've heard many scholars, including Christian female scholars, say that Milton is a misogynist. I think that this play speaks entirely against it. And maybe that's just simply because they don't read it. I don't know, because it's a lesser known play. But still, it's at the center of his poetic career, right in the middle of his poems, and at the height of his early reputation, at least until the later poems come along. Like, it's really central to his poetic corpus. So let's look at it briefly in at least a cursory manner. The wilderness, as it is set here, is just that. It's not just the forest. It is a wilderness. It's a wilderness in a biblical sense. It's a place that is forbidding to mankind. And it is marked by chaos and disorder. It bears all the consequences of the fall. And we need to realize that actually in Renaissance poetry in general, it's true of Shakespeare as well, that the wilderness is not just a dark forest. It's a realm that is fallen and bears the marks of the fall. And it's not only not neutral, it's hostile to humanity. There are spiritual threats in the forest. I talk about that when I speak about a Midsummer Night's Dream on a video that I put up on YouTube before. Very important, and this is characteristic of the Christian humanists of the 16th and the 17th century. So the wilderness is not only a dark place, it's a place that is hostile to humanity. And so when the lady goes into the wilderness, she's going into a place of temptation. And in a sense, then, she is a Christ figure. In the same sense that in I'm trying to think now. Oh yes, Christ in Paradise Regained goes into the wilderness and is tempted by the devil for 40 days. After 40 days, there are 3 temptations. Christ goes into the wilderness. This lady is doing exactly the same thing. So she is a Christ figure in female form. Very interesting in that sense. Very bold of Milton. Not usually accounted to be a feminist. I think he ought to be, given that she is really taking on a Christian analogous action here. So the lady represents the light that goes into the darkness, and the darkness does not overcome it. This is a recurrent motif in Milton's work, that the light can go in the midst of the darkness, however numerous, however powerful the darkness seems to be, the light can stand in the midst of it, even if it's only a solitary figure. And he repeats that motif in his work. It does not take an army to stand for God. It takes one faithful person. And he'll present it in the form of Uriel, one of the angels in heaven that refuses to go apostate. He stands on his own. In the midst of the apostate angels, there's one figure that says, no, I'm not going to go along with that. And he argues for it in his work, Areopagitica, the importance of free speech. The importance of free speech is not that everyone gets to have their say. It's that one virtuous man can stand and speak the truth and will be able to conquer his enemies, because the truth of God prevails over the wickedness and lies of the enemy. That's why. Well, we'll come to that when we read Areopagitica. But she goes into the darkness, into the wilderness, a theme that we'll see again in Samson Agonistes and also in Paradise Regained, temptation in the wilderness. Eve will also do this in the Garden of Eden, although the Garden of Eden is not a wilderness as of yet. But something comes out of the Garden of Eden which ought not to be there, and it becomes a wilderness. So what was a garden becomes a wilderness. In fact, they are cast out of the Garden of Eden and sent east of Eden into the wilderness. And so and that is an inhospitable place. It's going to be a place of thorns and thistles where it will be very difficult for them to even provide for themselves. It's going to be hard. They're going to have to work in the sweat of their brow just to eat. Much of their work is going to be subject to futility. Well, that's characteristic of the wilderness. It's a biblical theme. When God is standing up to the devil, he's going to go into the wilderness, or he's going to send his disobedient people into the wilderness. What happens to the people of Israel after they are delivered from the bonds, the bondage of Egypt? Well, they build a golden calf. What's the punishment for that? 40 years in the wilderness. Then they die before they get to the promised land, and then only 2 men get to go into the promised land. Right? So this idea of wilderness, very important here. Don't just think of it as a forest. You have to think of it in biblical terms, and you have to understand the theological significance of what's going on. It's a place of temptation. And the lady is going to be able to overcome the temptation because she's the light in a dark place. Later writers will pick this up as a constant theme. Same thing in The Lord of the Rings. The Phial of Galadriel. When you're in a dark place and all other lights have gone out, hold this up. It's the light of what? The stars. The favored star. Yes, but the light conquers the darkness. You might be little Samwise Gamgee, or you might be Frodo, because Frodo, it's given to Frodo, but Sam picks it up. And the servant is able, through that light, to stand against the creature Shelob that is about to devour him. One of the beasts of the ancient world, of which all are terrified. So what is there in the wilderness to tempt the lady? Well, it's actually just the natural world itself, which is not very, it's nature that's not very natural. It's not the good nature of the romantics. You have to see this. The romantics make nature into a goddess. They make nature good. They make it a place of innocence. They make it into something like the Garden of Eden. And they think just by virtue of a fiat word, a declared imaginative act, we can restore the ruins of paradise lost by just imagining that the created order is now, that there's no more sin in it. Doesn't work. And that's not what's going on here. they see the wilderness as the wild. We used to call it the wild, actually. That word, the wild, is no longer referred to. That's interesting in itself, that certain words fall into disusage. We don't talk about the wilderness. We talk about the forest. Well, the forest is not the same thing as the wilderness. And the wilderness reflects part of the dominion mandate given to Adam and Eve, which is to be fruitful and multiply and fill and subdue the earth, to make the world which is not yet domesticated and brought under God's influence to be like Eden. You're to make the whole earth into an Eden. All nations will do this. That's the purpose of the gospel. Preach the gospel to all nations and teach them to obey all that's been commanded. So she is the natural order itself, or the wilderness, is the source of temptation. And what is the temptation? Well, it's the desire to enter into the world of the wilderness and to be controlled by it, to act in accordance with the logic of the wilderness, rather than having the mind of Christ to be conformed to the pattern of this world. Right? Not Romans 12:2, no longer be conformed to the pattern of this world, but rather be transformed by the renewal of your minds. And how do you do that? By obedience with your body. Bodily obedience. So the nature is almost, it is the wrong word here. It's the wilderness. It's an uncontrolled force that is ruled by a hostile power, here represented by the figure of Comus. So personified hostility. Probably correspondent to Puck from Shakespeare's A Midsummer Night's Dream. It's a figure of disruption and chaos. Far more religious in Milton's sense than in Shakespeare. Shakespeare makes him a little bit less explicitly immoral. There he's just a figure of misrule. Here it's he's a figure of corruption. So the lady is a figure who personifies the virtue of chastity. What is chastity? Chastity is not mere sexual continence. So she's not promiscuous. She is chaste in a sense that her whole spiritual being is also not corrupted. It's not that she doesn't have inappropriate sexual liaisons. It's that her spirit is very close to God. Even in the presence of enemies, God is with her and she knows God's presence. Just as Christ also has to pray when he goes into the wilderness for help, likewise the lady receives help. She's aware of that, even though she sees to be on her own. So she represents chastity as an ideal. So it's a symbol of her spiritual strength, in other words. So her virginity, her chastity, is a symbol of much more than physical abstinence. It represents her spiritual strength, just like Isabella is in Measure for Measure. If you've watched that play, read that play. I'll do Shakespeare next year. I do Measure for Measure. Isabella is a similar figure of spiritual strength. The brothers, on the other hand, are different. Now, the lady, interestingly again, is associated with reason and thought and spiritual strength. She represents the contemplative life. She represents the life historically associated with philosophers and theologians. Again, Milton is being revolutionary by associating a woman with this. Because he would, again, in Milton's understanding of church government, he's not going to allow women in the pulpit. It's not that he's saying that women ought to be priests or women ought to be pastors, but he is saying that women can represent the ideal of the held throughout the ancient and Christian era. They can represent reason and contemplation And the men here, her brothers, are associated with action. They're the vita activa. As I say, I wish I had done l'allegro and il penseroso here because, but it doesn't matter which order we do them in, because l'allegro represents the active life, the life of the man of politics, the man of action, whereas the vita contemplativa is represented by il penseroso, the melancholic one, but also the contemplative one, the philosophic life, the internal life, if you will. And she represents that. Now, whether Milton begins the association of women's virtues with internal things and men's with externals, that's a different subject of debate, and that's probably an interesting thought to pursue that a little bit. But Milton certainly does it here. He associates the brothers with action, and quite frankly with being stupid, and the sister with contemplation and virtue. So again, very feminist portrait by an author often associated with misogyny. The brothers' only virtue is their endurance and recognition of their sister's virtue. Note that the girl, remember this is a performance in a castle, Ludlow Castle, and the girl is not a character per se, but more of a female personification of virtue, in the same sense that wisdom is personified in the book of Proverbs. So Proverbs 1-9, we have Lady Wisdom. That's not a character per se, it's the personification, a female personification of virtue. That's what the lady represents here. So in a sense, I'm going to argue against what I've just said. It's not really pro-female per se, it's pro-virtue. And it's just that the form of virtue happens to be represented as female. And we should love that virtue, whether we're male or female. We should want to be like the lady. One way of seeing this, and this was what was taught to me years ago, it was just a thought. I don't know how much the text supports it, but I think there's some support for it. The lady has the role of Odysseus, and Comus has a role something akin to that of Circe, the witch that seeks to defraud Odysseus and bring grotesque parodies out of natural action. Odysseus is a hero, and he's tempted by Circe to grotesque things. Remember, she turns pigs into swine. There's repeated references in Comus of exactly this sort of action. Shakespeare's Macbeth, the men, when they drink, they have swinish sleep. And the reference, again, there to Circe, there's something that's more than drunkenness being referred to. It's a sort of a corruption of their spiritual nature going on. But you will note that this play, just like Samson Agonistes and many closet dramas, although it is here performed, so it's not really a closet drama, not much goes on in the play. The brothers and the lady don't actually do much. And in the case of the lady, all she does is stand and assume that no evil can touch her. She has faith. She has faith. So again, you put on the armor of God in Ephesians 6, verse 12 and following. And after you've done everything else, you put on the breastplate of righteousness, the helmet of salvation, the sword of truth, the shoes of right. After you put on all those things, what do you do with that? Do you go out and charge into battle? No, you stand. That's what she does. So she represents the fully armed Christian. Armed with what? Armed with faith in God. Armed with standing in Christ. And that is sufficient. She doesn't need to fight. She just needs to stand her ground. And she will be saved. How will she be saved? Will it be by her action? No, it will be she will be saved by God intervening for her. He will do the work. So he's reflecting on mythology as Milton when he writes this play, but he is clearly giving a higher meaning to the form of the mask than is conventionally, because this is conventionally associated with mythology and all sorts of debauchery and paganism and so forth. Milton is using the mythology, but he's using that sort of just as a backdrop. He wants to talk about Christian virtue. And so he's baptizing the myths, just like Augustine said we should do, that the Israelites were to do with the treasure that was plundered from Egypt. They're to use it to worship God aright. That's what Milton is doing with the form of the Masque here. And I've suggested to you that's what he does throughout his corpus of writing. We'll see he famously does it with the pagan epic. He baptizes it, as it were, for lack of a better term, and makes it a Christian form of writing. It removes all the associations. It's not going to be there to worship the pagan gods. It's going to be there to worship the one true God. Different role of virtue here. Oops. So note what I said to you earlier there. There are dances. There are stage directions. So line 92, Comus enters with a charming rod in one hand, his glass in the other, and with him a rout of monsters headed like sundry sorts of wild beasts, but otherwise like men and women. Their apparel glistering, they come in making a riotous and unruly noise with torches in their hands. Note again the reference to the noise that they make as opposed to the music. They represent discord, and there's something monstrous about their actions. Likewise, in line 230 to 242, we have a song set in the midst of the performance. You'll find this true of Shakespeare's comedies as well. Occasionally in the tragedies, but mostly in the comedies, there are songs interspersed, seen as part of the pageantry of the whole thing. Comus and his whole misshapen rabble represents libidinous sexuality. No moderation for sex, no venue for sex, just sex on demand. And he offers wine, which again is associated with loosening of desires and so forth. It's part of his one of his tools, if you will. Not that wine is wrong in itself. The glass that he holds is probably a magician's crystal ball. It's a parody of kingship, by the way. When a king is crowned, we'll find that when Charles is crowned in May or whatever it is, he will hold a scepter and an orb. These are symbols of kingship. Comus comes as a king here. And what sort of kingship does he offer? A kingdom of anarchy, sexual transgression, and perversion in the midst of the wilderness. So he is a sort of a king, offering delights that come with his reign. And he himself probably represents a union of Bacchus and Circe, Bacchus the wine god with Circe, who offers sex and perversion through that. And so Milton is writing not against paganism per se, but against vice and corruption. So more explicitly Christian. The pagan myths can be construed in moral terms, or they can be more neutral, if you will. Milton makes them explicitly anti-Christian, and his message against them, therefore, explicitly pro-Christian. So he Christianizes the whole genre of the Masque here in the way he sets things up. Whereas the chorus, when it comes in, represents the forces of nature that are in some sense balanced against the unnatural self-indulgence that Comus is promoting. So the shepherds are a force of good, just like the shepherds in Scripture. These are men, these are salt of the earth. They look after the sheep. They fight off the wolf. They're not sufficient to fight off Comus per se, but they're positive agents, if you will. In general, the moral of Comus is that we live not only in a spiritual world, but also in a natural world, and we need to avoid the excesses that are incumbent upon a having physical being, either starvation on the one hand or gluttony on the other. Comus represents gluttony. But neither of them are sufficient, and both of them taken to excess will kill us. One will kill us bodily, the other will kill us spiritually. Note that when Jesus goes into the wilderness, he fasts, however. He recognizes the battle isn't a physical one, it's a spiritual one. But it's at the end of the 40 days when the temptation proper ensues. He resists one form of temptation to give way to three more serious. And the lady knows that her life ought to be centered around a right relation to God. And it's her own intrinsic goodness that renders her courageous in the face of a serious threat. She doesn't feel scared. And the reason she doesn't feel scared is she knows that no weapon forged by the enemy can harm her. Whatever nature it comes, whether physical or spiritual, she is sufficient to have stood, though free to fall. That's how God forms Adam and Eve. Those are the exact words that God uses in Book 3 of Paradise Lost. I created him just and right, sufficient to have stood, though free to fall. Such he created all the celestial beings, so also he creates the lady, and the lady knows wherein her strength resides. Samson foolishly doesn't. The lady is wiser than Samson. Samson only realizes right at the end of his life. And as I say, we really ought to compare and contrast her to the portrait of the female in Paradise Lost of Eve. That would be an interesting subject for an essay. But also the emphasis throughout Milton's corpus of writing on liberty, the importance of liberty. God creates freedom, he loves freedom, he hates slavery. There are many forms of slavery. Physical forms of slavery are bad enough. There are worse forms of slavery than physical slavery. Spiritual bondage. In the case of Egypt, they're delivered from both. They're in physical bondage, they cannot leave. They're not allowed to leave, they have masters. Even worse than that, they worship, the masters worship false gods and demand sacrifices from their slaves that come with the worship of those gods. So they're willing to work them to the point of forcing them to make bricks without straw and demand that they work even harder. So there's no recognition of human frailty there whatsoever, no recognition of the fact that these Hebrew slaves bear the image of God, and eventually God says, enough, we're going to end this. But there's a freedom that comes with it. God hates slavery. But the worst form of slavery is the slavery to sin. And there's too little of that discussion today when we speak about the African slave trade and the slavery that came with it. As bad as that is, it's the dehumanization of false religion that makes it that much worse. Some people even euphemistically call being forced to work and maintain keep your head above the water, wage slavery. I have to work in order just to keep myself alive. They call that wage slavery. Well, this is a metaphorical use, but I understand what they mean. I have to do this. I am compelled. I have no freedom to choose not to do this. In a sense, you are then the slave of your employer. In a sense, You could quit. Of course, maybe you'll find a job, but in a sense, there's a sense of compulsion there. But that's because of a physical compulsion. Is there more than, can things get worse than that? Oh, yes, they can. Absolutely. And when you get to the point where, and I get this discussion in relation to things like prostitution as well. What's the difference between prostitution, this particular form of work, they call it, and other activities, because they're being paid for it and they choose to do this and so forth. Yes, but they're selling their own bodies. That's the difference. You're selling your own body, and by selling your own body, you're in a sense acting against your own self-interest, even though you're making means to support yourself. And you may make good wage, or in most cases certainly not. You're being exploited by somebody, but that's not the point. You're acting against yourself here. So even if you consent to it, there's a corruption going on, in the same sense that you will say that you can't sell your own organs and so forth. There's a sense of an ethical line that's been breached there when you you choose to do that. And it used to be the case that the law prevented you from selling yourself into slavery. So even if you choose to do that, you can't. Anyway, so emphasis on liberty, and the words of the emphasis on the importance of the words as well. There's this almost, for lack of a better word, magical significance to words here. The power of language to speak and hold and resist the hostility of sin and corruption. And so in 2:16, because of the brightness of chastity, Comus can spot the lady at night. You can actually see her because she is visible, and there's something about her virtue which overpowers him. We'll find the same thing in Paradise Lost when Milton first spies Eve. He's awed by her very presence, and subdued even. It presents him as being incapable. Even though he wants to corrupt her, he sees her on her own. Actually, it's in book 9. He sees her and he spots her and he says, I got her on her own. I've been waiting for this moment. He can't do it at first because of her virtue. It's not because of her beauty. It's because her virtue is tied in with her beauty. Her beauty and her goodness are connected, and her virtue overpowers him. He can't bring himself to do it. And then the hostility within him overcomes that initial reluctance. But it says something about the power of virtue. Never underestimate the power of virtue. I actually happen to think it has a power. So be brave in the midst of threats, and you will find that it is an extraordinary. Your best security is being confident in God. And it has a force, because remember, your opponents tend to be cowardly and they tend to be corrupt. They're not even proud of themselves and what they're about to do. Somebody who stands with virtue is, in a sense, a very intimidating thing. And so you don't have to physically beat them. So she has a sober certainty of waking bliss, it's presented as. She has a faith. Whereas her brothers, as I say, are totally in the dark. They are armed. They're physically strong. They're called philosophers, but they are unguided. But what preserves the lady, and let me conclude with this, because I've realized I've just overshot my time, is 381 to 385, great lines, which will echo the message of Paradise Lost even. I'll just lead up to it. I'll read from 375. And wisdom's self oft seeks to sweet retired solitude, where with her best nurse, contemplation, she plumes her feathers, and lets grow her wings, that in the various bustle of resort were all too ruffled, and sometimes impaired. And here's the counterpoint to that. He that has light within his own clear breast may sit in the center and enjoy bright day. But he that hides a dark soul and foul thoughts, benighted walks under the midday sun. Himself is his own dungeon. In other words, you'll have a paradise within, happier far. It reflects exactly what I just said. If you have dark thoughts, if you are corrupted, if you are aren't clothed in Christ's righteousness, you can walk in the midday sun and you're in a dungeon. But if you are clothed in Christ's righteousness, you have a light within you that will allow you to go into the darkest places of the earth in the midst of your enemies, and God has prepared a table for you. Psalm 23, right? The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want. In the midst of my enemies, he's prepared a table. It's that sense of God's presence. Emmanuel, God with us. That's the emphasis of Milton's Paradise Lost and throughout his political writings as well. Okay, I'll conclude with that.